Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Clayworks. We are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located in Piscataway and Susquehannock land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Patrick Bell. He is the 2022 to 2023 Lormina Salter Fellow. For more information about our artist talks, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org. And I will now turn it over to Patrick.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Rebecca just mentioned, I'm the Lormina Salter Fellow here. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Kayla, and everybody who organized these. Just before I began, it's been really great to be here. The studio, the community. I'm really happy to be able to work in this space, and so thanks to everyone who's organized this and for the ability to work in this space. I'm going to pull up. Let's see my PowerPoint here. So the first slide that I want to show is an image of me. One is towards the end of my time period in undergrad, that's on the right, and on the left is right about the time when I started my post-bac out in Wichita, Kansas. And part of why I want to show this is because a lot of my work deals with this idea of working against this myth or this ideology that mental problems are mental and physical problems are physical, that there is this kind of division and that one is separate from the other, one doesn't influence the other. Moving into undergrad and post that time was a really anxious time period for me, and I dealt with a lot of sort of these undefinable or at the time very strange to me medical symptoms, a lot of which had their roots in these anxious thoughts or these anxious moments. And another important, so I'm going to talk a lot about the body, sort of internal and external as well. Two events that sort of happened in between these photos as well that are really important to my work are one was a brain surgery that I had about 2015, so a little bit after probably this image on the right was taken. And then in 2016, my father passed from prostate cancer. And so, again, these are two important moments in my life, but they're also very, these are sort of emotional events that, again, have very physical results or physical impacts. And so, like I said, around at the time in undergrad, they were a lot more mysterious to me. But moving forward, they started to become those symptoms, those physical symptoms, started to become much more sort of traceable, if you will. So this is my pop. It's a quick photo of him, not necessarily relevant beyond it. It's just a nice photo I like. But he was there's a lot about him that I emulate. He was a physician. He was a healthcare provider, which is something that a number of people in my family are, and so that's an influence I take. But suffice to say, his passing was something that his passing from prostate cancer in particular, in addition to my brain surgery, were two things that really got me thinking about my body, health, and in particular this time, the American healthcare system sort of specifically. So I'm sort of starting off towards the end of my time period, work-wise, in undergrad. Because that's when I sort of started to get sculptural. I sort of started to bring the body into my work. Most of my undergraduate was atmospheric pottery, so wood firing, soda firing, and the occasional cone 10. But towards the end, these were sort of my last year. I was still wood firing, and I was still, based in the vessel. So these are all sort of pottery influence, but especially on the sort of outsides, on the left and the right, you can start to see those figurative or bodily influences coming into my work just a little bit. And then, perhaps the most referential of or emblematic of what would come in my undergrad work were these collections, this work and the next work I'll show, which still, I'm working with the vessel. So in a way, it sort of feels timid. I'm moving from pottery to sculpture in a way, but it's still, again, very much tied to those ideas of the vessel. but starting to mix in other media, so these copper tubes, and you can also see the sort of early development of these sort of pill forms, which come up in a number of my works sort of moving forward. This work even perhaps more just silly to me. They're really interesting, these works that, going back and looking at all these things and thinking about sort of the time period from where they're at. But this is just another example of that sort of still atmospheric, still in that sort of vessel-based thinking. So of course, these are two thrown parts on top of each other. But this is also, maybe where I start to think about my father's experience in prosthetics, which is something that he did. And so almost like the augmentation of the body or the adding of foreign elements to the body is something that I think is sort of bubbling to the surface here. And as I mentioned, I moved to Kansas following undergraduate at Wichita State University, where I studied with Ted Adler and Brenda Lichman and a number of really great people that I was fortunate to cross paths with. I think it's interesting, again, looking back and thinking about all these sort of transitionary moments. I know I had a professor who would talk about a sort of the swinging of a pendulum, where I think every time I move to a different place or I move to these different opportunities, I tend to sort of swing wide or move a little bit further away from maybe what I'm comfortable with, and then sort of swing back. And so with that in mind, when I got into Wichita, I was really thinking in a much more mixed media way, and thinking more again about that kind of augmentation of the body. So you can see cinder blocks, found objects, threaded metal right behind me that are all sort of stand-ins for these anatomical parts. My work, sort of the newest body, or as I see it, sort of developing into the language I've been using lately, is oftentimes sort of figurative references or these more amorphous visceral references. And so here I think you see a little bit of both of those on the right, more the sort of contrapposto visceral, viscera, but more of a figurative representation. On the left, you see the sort of aorta, ventricle, maybe lung sort of reference. And so a lot of these sort of especially the organs, the sort of amorphous viscera. There are these representations or these sort of physical manifestations of these amorphous feelings or these sporadic pains and sort of undefinable feelings that, again, in large parts, in hindsight, come from anxiety, producing situations, and a number of other things that some are in my control and some are not. But again, sort of dealing with trying to diagnose these things, dealing with trying to understand these things. And in a large part, these works end up becoming that sort of discovery or that search. They become that sort of thing that helps me understand my physical body more than, say, any doctor's appointment or more than sort of most external advice that I received during this time. So these are more of some of the figurative works, and they start to get a little bit more involved with these ideas of loneliness and isolation. These are both from a series called Deject, which when I was in Wichita, I was really sort of enamored, for lack of a better term, with Julia Kristova's theories of abjection and dejection, and these ideas of, in particular, these elements of ourselves or these qualities of our humanity that we push away or we reject and we deny. And so that's where these sort of names and in a large part the sort of way of thinking comes from. But like I said, that they start to engage a little bit more with those ideas of isolation and loneliness, which a lot of my work is dealing with more now. But for context, again, this is shortly after my father's passed. I'm in the middle of the country, very far from anyone I know, and so a lot of these ideas, again, of where am I, who am I, are really bubbling up. There's a lot of work that I made around this time that I'm not going to show much of. I might have one piece that sort of deals a lot with the ideas of home, and in a way that's this kind of parallel of it's less about the sort of physical structure, but the idea of home. And when you go from one place to another, when you lose one person that's been a part of your life, your sort of foundational understanding of home, how do these sort of redefine these ideas? And so those kind of play into these ideas of loneliness as well. But I don't have much of the sort of house or homework in this presentation. Another really great thing about Wichita was the space, which is always nice and always a tricky thing with ceramics and sculpture. But this was a work on a 4x8 piece of wood, and so the ability to set up large scale work, photograph it effectively, and not be in anybody's way is always great. And again, playing with that sort of mixed media that I'm always trying to sort of see when sort of ceramics is purely necessary and when other media can play a role. Even this is more about sort of absence. So whether it's ceramic or something else, the absence of the body here, being particularly important. I started to get into, again, thinking about that sort of pendulum. I started to get into colored cement, foam, and some unfired ceramic. This is some fired clay. Foam, ceramic, and paint. Paint has been it's something I use more often nowadays, but it's been kind of a double-edged sword for me. But Wichita was really good for letting me explore these things. Being outside of a degree program was really important to me. And it's something I tell any students who talk about that sort of trajectory that they might be thinking about. Is that time away or that time in between was really important for me. And these are just some more examples. On the left, the main figure is ceramic and the rest is colored cement. On the right, that's foam and just purely colored cement, sort of building up this form from these poured layers that you can sort of start to see on the top. And then one of the last works I want to show, the last two works I want to show from Wichita are these, where I start to get into more of that, as I reference the sort of amorphous organs, these organs that, in a way are sort of stand-ins for these amorphous or undefinable pains. So, where are these emotions or where are these physical sensations coming from? If I can't diagnose them or find out where they're coming from, they must be coming from this sort of foreign entity or this foreign body. And it's this kind of thought process that leads to a lot of the creation of sort of, undefinable organs again. On the right, you're seeing more of a traditional process, but on the left, as I was talking about paint, that's one of the earlier examples of painted pieces that I've felt a little bit better on how that surface comes out. A big issue with painted objects, sometimes they might look better in photo or in person, but oftentimes in person, there's a real issue with sort of surface quality to them. So this was an important piece to sort of, every time I have a little bit of success, it sort of encourages me to explore a bit more. And then in 2018, I went to grad school. So I went to Kent State, which allowed me again to sort of expand, think about other things that I might not have thought about in a different sort of environment. So moving those geographies constantly, something that's really characterized my work. And this was just one example of an installation work that I was able to make there. So I've been thinking a little bit more about installation since my time there and in Wichita, or the Wichita bit as well. But this was one of the pieces I kind of referenced earlier that most referential to that idea of home or house. And so this kind of impermanent foundation, again, the sort of absence. So this sort of wall image or this painting or this poster that sort of gives you less, gives more questions unanswered than answered. This suitcase in front of me has these different cast, they're almost sort of like plaques. Some of them are cast colored cement, some of them are ceramic. And so they're almost these sort of like empty tablets. All of these sort of, again, building on that idea of home, building on that idea of home is sort of more than a structure. So the really sort of cheesy idea that I was trying to not say too much in grad school is like home is where the heart is, but it's this idea that home is more than a physical object. It's this metaphysical idea that has influence in a lot of things beyond sort of where you are or what structure you exist in. And I played a little bit more with installation in grad school. Largely my work was, you might say, more object-based, but again, it was, sort of thinking about that pendulum, a really exciting time to be able to spread out, have a lot of space to work, and be, to some degree, sort of unencumbered by too many concerns of maybe sort of the productivity of undergrad, a little bit sort of looser, especially taking some of that time off. This is sort of that, a little thinking, again, about mixed media, thinking about a lot about color and the color of hospitals and interior spaces where medical practices happen, and sort of combining that with these, again, these sort of absent bodies, or these bodies absent of sort of key elements. And still a little bit of the mixed media again. So the installation, the mixed media, these sort of influences or these ideas, they came with me through Wichita, but largely the cast cement and the sort of purely mixed media works like this, and When the House Was Standing, sort of fell to the wayside a bit, or didn't make it quite out of grad school. But here again, you can see that that's colored cement on the bottom and just regular uncolored cement on the top. But again, that sort of reference to the organ of the body and tension, or that sense of tightness being referenced in that work. This was a series that I made in grad school. These were called, I refer to these as like fruit baskets, which was, obviously a little bit tongue in cheek. The idea of these was that, or the sort of formal idea of these was that they were constructed, these sort of under sections, these basins. I was thinking about Sterling Ruby's basins as well, and these other sort of containers for objects. And so these bottom areas, here, here, and here, would have been constructed first, and then it would have been sort of filled with wet clay with all of these sort of visceral references, and fired again, and then glazed again. This sort of has a vertical form that this was built separately, and then including these fired works sort of stabbing into the abdomen, which again, a lot of these are sort of gastrointestinal, or based around the abdomen, which is where a lot of these sort of sensations or sort of undiagnosable problems were particularly coming from for me. And then towards the end of grad school, I was making work that was a little bit more referential. So, still thinking about these things in tension, these things in chaos, and playing a little bit with mixed media as well. So in the center, fired ceramic with resin. On the right, that's unfired. So the main form is unfired ceramic with resin, and a fired ceramic piece included. And then over here, painted unfired ceramic with metal and fired ceramic inclusion. This being on the left a little bit specific, of course, to that brain surgery. So those specific moments still sort of playing an important role, but a lot of these elements that were coming, or a lot of these sculptures that were coming towards the end of graduate school, were just sort of amorphous objects, whether they related specifically to situations that I underwent, like the brain, or maybe more broadly reference the body, like the heart, and consequently these ideas perhaps of emotion or love, which hadn't really entered my work until I'd say at the end of grad school, and they start to sort of sneak up on me in the year after grad school. And so these were some of the works that I made towards the end of grad school. On the left, you can see the inclusion of some gridded wire again, so thinking still about that mixed media. The left a little bit, but on the right especially, I think is one of the earliest examples of where my work gets sort of more objectively sexual, or has these sort of more explicit sexual undertones that, at this point for me are still sort of being discovered through the work and sort of finding that out. And these were the last works that were made in grad school. I graduated in March of 2020, and so these were never actually shown, but these are about 3 feet tall, and these are my sort of last creations of sort of mixing that visceral with the figurative. So using that scale and form brought, very, very abstractly speaking, of the body, and then using the form of these sort of elbows or arms or knees, or of course intestines may be the most direct reference. And so I moved back to Pittsburgh after grad school. I moved in with a buddy from high school or undergrad, I should say, I was happier to be here than I look in this photo. But this is the one that I have from my little garage studio, which is, again, in hindsight, very, very lucky to have a place to work and make my pieces out of grad school. It was a sort of difficult time for me. I felt sort of resigned to using underglaze because I really didn't feel like at that point I had a reliable approach towards paint, that it was really looking kind of rough. Wasn't looking sort of having the surface that I wanted. So I started to make these pieces that are, really, I think, more characteristic of the work that I'm making today. And we're all underglazed and then either lacquered or enameled. So I use enamel still today. I was using lacquer at this time, but it was really important for me, arguably, this is untitled. It was really important for me, arguably, to be in that situation where I didn't maybe have as much access to kilns or firings, because that led me to experiment with these materials like enamel and lacquer. And then I was very lucky to get a job teaching at CCBC the following year. And so I moved back out here to Baltimore. And these are just a few of the pieces that I made while I was there. This is one of them. I'll show another. And the job that I got was teaching art history, which has been a really fun time for me. I went to school for ceramics, and certainly I studied a lot of art histories, but it's been exciting for me sort of relearning and sort of re-solidifying those kind of important aspects of my work, the sort of art historical references. And so I think that's led to a number of works when I got here that were maybe a little bit more directly referential. This work was definitely more sort of directly referential of the procedure that I had to have, this endoscopy. And I was thinking it's a little bit hard to see in this image, but the sort of genesis of this work was that this mouth is this tube that's sort of external to the body. It goes all the way through the body, in and out, whenever sort of leaks out or goes into any of the sort of separate spaces, sort of this one sort of tube through the body. And so that was kind of the main inspiration for this work. But then, of course, you can see the inspiration of Francis Bacon on the right, who's one of my favorite painters. This work on the left, Monument, is one of the newer works that I made this year. And I'm also a big fan of Philip Guston, so color as well as form. He made a lot of these shoes, representations of shoes, and in particular, I thought there was so much sort of visual influence here that I named these the same. It's a monument on the left and a monument on the right. This is my work Kiss on the left, and then you're all probably familiar with Brancusi's Kiss on the right. I also took a lot of influence in this work from Alex de Corte's Rochi Biv, which was in the Whitney Biennial this year. Unfortunately, there's not many ways to find that online, but if you ever have the ability to see that, it's really great. It's an animation and a video, and in part sort of shows the backstory or the history perhaps of these two figures. And so I was thinking a lot about that while I was making these pieces too. These are some more of these figurative works. Still thinking about medicine a bit. I'm a little bit hesitant working with those pill forms more lately. It's very much about sort of like supplements or anxiety medication, this idea of constantly ingesting these things, and the idea of stigma around medication, whereas that's not always the first thing people think about when they see pills. And so this was maybe one of the earlier works that I was making when I got to Baltimore, but you can see so much of the pill references here, but it's kind of self-embracing figure. So still dealing with those ideas of loneliness and isolation. And then I just included a few of these, I call them these walkers. There's only a few of them that I've made, these pieces sort of standing on these fingers a bit precariously. And they're more of these sort of self-probing objects, as I talk about. This was made a little bit earlier, but another one of those sort of, again, sort of the object feeling itself. And this, as I mentioned earlier, this is an example of one of the more sort of in-your-face pill references, if you will. And this is one of my newer works. Again, that's it's trying to sort of reference the sense of figuring oneself out, sort of picking at oneself physically here, but in a lot of ways, sort of metaphorically, is what my work aims to do. So just quickly, I want to run through a couple of my visual influences. I already showed some more of the art historical references. Some of the more contemporary influences that I have are Derek, Genesis. Bellinger's, her work is killer. I'm always looking at what she's putting out. Her references to the body and medication are fantastic. Peter Barber also makes some really great work with ceramic, clay, unfired clay. This is straw unfired and unfired clay. Anita Regal is really interesting to me, and as far as her reference to sort of amorphous body or these amorphous visceral references, as well as Anne-Marie Lauries, who not entirely unlike Derek Weisberg. I really like how she shows that process. So these are primarily wheel thrown. You can see some of the throw lines, especially in the left over here. So using these processes in a way that sort of inventive and changes the way that we think about them. And then a few painters. I've been really into Baldur Helgason lately. Something that, if you've seen me in the studio, you might hear me say in the last few years, I want my work to be a little bit funnier. Sometimes it can be sort of violent and grotesque. And I think there's a way to talk about some of those bodily things or those emotional things in a way that's maybe a little bit sillier or funny. And so Baldur, I definitely like for that reason, as well as Louise Benet, who deals with the body and deals with sexuality and these ideas of the sort of intimate in a way that I really like as well. And again, in sort of silly, almost cartoony ways that are really palatable. And then the last work artist that I want to talk about show is Sarah Slappy, who she was a visiting artist at some point in grad school. And again, the references to the body, the references to sexuality and medication, all of these things are things that she's dealing with often, and I really enjoy the way that she deals with them. So that's the last thing I'm going to show today. It gives us a little bit of time for questions if anybody has them. But thank you all for being here. I appreciate it very much.